This is a lesson from our Animation Foundations course. To get the full course, go to bloopanimation.com/animationfoundations.
Squash and stretch describe how an object changes shape in response to forces acting on it. Squash is when an object is compressed by an impact or an opposing force. Stretch is when an object is distended by something pulling on it or by moving quickly. Let's look at some examples and then we can try for ourselves. Here's a classic bouncing ball example. You can see the ball squashes when it hits the ground and stretches here and here. These are the spots where the ball is moving at its fastest. Compare that ball to this one without any squash and stretch. You can see how the distortion of the ball emphasizes the path the ball travels, almost like motion blur. It also helps convey the rhythm of the bounce better. It's just more pleasant to watch. Another important way to use squash and stretch is to convey the material that an object is made of. Softer materials like rubber will distort more, while rigid materials like metal will distort less. However, even if you're dealing with something super rigid like this metal ball, still try to incorporate a little squash and stretch. Stretch will tend to look fine because at high speed it will seem like motion blur. And when you have an impact, even a frame or two of squash can make a big difference. Even if it's so subtle you wouldn't notice it at full speed, you can feel the impact more. It's important that when you squash and stretch, you want the volume of the object to stay consistent. Otherwise, it will just look like the object is growing and shrinking, not deforming. So if something gets shorter, it should also get wider. And if it gets longer, it should also get thinner. You probably already realize that the more you push your squash and stretch, the more cartoony your animation will look. It tends to give animation a cute or comedic effect. Exaggerated squash and stretch, and exaggeration in general, is a big part of what defines the look of classic comedy cartoons like Tom and Jerry and Looney Tunes. But even in more serious animation, you can still find squash and stretch being used, especially during fast movements and action scenes. Slipping in a squashed or stretched frame at the right moment can help make all those rapid frame changes flow together much more smoothly, making it easier for the eye to understand. If you're working in 3D, squash and stretch tends to be more subtle. Ideally, you would want a character rig that lets you distort the model to get that squash and stretch. But even if you don't have a rig that sophisticated, you can still achieve many of the same benefits of squash and stretch just by being smart about how you pose your character. Look at how this ninja jumps down from the ledge. At first glance, it seems like there's squash and stretch going on here. But if we look at the individual poses, the character isn't really distorted at all. He's just posed so his body is fully extended in the fall and folded up at the start and end of the fall. Squash and stretch ultimately is just about maximizing the difference in overall shape between your keyframes. So even if you're not trying to achieve a cartoony look, keep the principle of squash and stretch in mind as you pose your characters. Next, let's take a look at how to apply squash and stretch to a character. This little guy, Tony the Panda. For this video, we're only going to deal with Tony's body. The rest of him gets added in a second pass later. So Tony's going to turn his head, crouch down, and leap out of the scene. This animation is going to be 24 frames a second, animated on 2s, so I'm only going to draw on the odd-numbered frames. So we have him standing on frame 1, and we'll put his fully crouched pose on frame 13. We'll fill in the in-between frames later. We're just doing really loose sketches. Remember, we're mostly focusing on how we're posing the character. So the next keyframe for this animation is when Tony is at the top of his jump on the way out. We'll put that on frame 19. We want his body fully extended, but this isn't actually going to be the most stretched out frame. Let's put the end of his jump's arc on frame 23. It's going to be off screen, so we'll just leave it really rough. We just need it as reference to get the other frames right. So now let's start filling in the gaps. Frame 17 here is where I'm going to put our most stretched out pose. I want the jump to feel really zippy, so we're going to have him cover the whole side of this arc of the jump in just this one drawing. Now I'm going to flip through the drawings to see how the motion looks. So far so good, but we have a couple more drawings to fill in. Let's go to frame 15. You might think we would start stretching out the body here, but I'm actually going to squash him even more here. His power is coming mainly from his hind legs, so here his back is moving forward a little bit faster than his front, compressing just a little bit more before it all gets released on frame 17. We're maximizing the shape change between these two frames to make that jump extra explosive. So now let's flip again to check it out. Good, now let's fill in that missing frame 21. Again, his head's out of frame, so we'll leave that off. There, now let's recenter the camera and check the animation. Okay, so that's the stretch. Now let's go back and do the squash at the beginning. I'm actually not going to start the squash yet, but get a little stretch in on this one frame. His head is going to move up in anticipation of bending down, though his head is going to start to turn. Now let's go to frame 7. I'm putting it way down here because I want that duck to be fairly quick. Next, let's do frame 9. These drawings here will be really close together because I want him to ease in slowly to the squashed position, storing up energy for that big jump. Now for frame 5, we're going to do something interesting. His head has to cover a lot of distance in this frame, so we're going to do some stretch, but just on his face. And we'll flip to check it. There. Doing stretches like that is important to achieve this kind of zippy timing. Now we just have that last drawing on frame 11. This one is going to be really close to these other drawings. That looks like we've got it. Let's take a look at the final animation.